like to conclude this final panel and would like to summarize what we learned during the last 2 days. Of course, we learned a lot and some was overwhelming and certainly it was challenging to follow this morning, and there's so many details that we have to memorize, but I just wanted to recap the key issues that you should take home to your institution, that you should share with your colleagues. And that is the importance of the documentation of the artwork in its native environment with all its components and behaviors. To understand the autonomy of the artwork and all the components and relationships. To understand the significances and the dependencies, including the hardware, the operating system, and the software. The importance to obtain the artist's source code, including any dependencies such as external libraries. To document the programming environment, including the operating system, the programming language, and the hardware, and the importance of the code analysis to document the behaviors and also the aesthetics of the artworks. And I would like to mention that I really enjoyed hearing from Glenn and Dina that you refer to the code analysis as an analytical tool that we can add as technical art history to our analytical palette. And as we have done with our field of time-based media art, we have borrowed from other sciences and looked at how we can quantify our findings, how we can reproduce our findings. And this is certainly a great way of doing so right here for software-based art. The importance, and we exercised this morning, to use version control like Git to document any interventions and changes over time. And of course, we are all at the beginning, and it's so much about building collaborations within a larger network as we move forward. And I want to just keep it like that and want to encourage you for the remaining time on the panel that you use the knowledge and expertise, not only here on the panel, but in the entire room, to discuss practical issues that you come across within your institution. So I welcome your questions.
Brian Duda, National Gallery of Art. I'm just interested in the technical troubleshooting of some of these works, and when you're actually trying to get them to run, what is the process? Why are these emulators altering the behavior of the programs? And I was thinking of that Sow Farm, where it seemed like everything was the same as the original equipment, but when running in the emulator, it had that jitter. And why was it doing that? And why are these emulators altering it? Thanks.
I think the question was, why are things like emulators not being necessarily faithful? Like, if you have something that is supposed to be doing the exact same thing as the original hardware, what is the reason for the differences? Is that accurate? Okay. Well, I think it's important to remember that the difference between software-based artworks and any other kind of artwork is that there's always interpretation. There will always be interpretation. So even with, you have the executable or the interpreted code or whatever, there's there's the native environment, but an emulator is basically something that was designed by a person. So, maybe they didn't do a very good job of ensuring that it is interpreting, Corey's ROM exactly the way an NES would, or maybe it's, so maybe the implementation is faulty. But I think also it's important to note with that specific case that there was more than just the emulator in the picture. And with virtualization, that's particularly important to remember that virtualization is different from emulation, that it's not a faithful recreation of the original environment. It's simply creating a virtual computer in which it's contained. So virtualization isn't even endeavoring to be a faithful reproduction of a native environment.
But I would like to add that, for example, examining color, one can go to the source code, see exactly what the color is, reproduce that color on a monitor or a display that has been calibrated and completely double-checked, and at that point, there's not, even though there are these mitigating influences, you can still go back to see exactly what it is we wanted that should be there.
So it occurs to me that there are two things that it would be interesting to do, given that you have version control that's available. One is to actually instrument the code, since timing is one of these things that we're really interested in. I wonder whether anyone has actually tried that. And the other is, I was wondering what unit testing for this kind of thing would look like.
I don't know what unit testing is. Sorry.
And I didn't hear your first question.
Sorry, has anyone actually, so timing is one of these things that we're really interested in.
Yes.
And particularly with reference to Untitled Film 2, I noticed in the source code that some of the timing depended on rather convoluted randomization functions, which are obviously completely impossible to replicate faithfully.
Yes.
So has anyone tried like instrumenting the code to determine timing rather than just trying to port the code?
So by instrumenting the code, I think what you mean is to sort of play it in a way that it could be controlled.
So there's different ways of instrumenting code. You can actually use profiling to see how often functions repeat, or you can actually inject code into it to write to a log file. That would be a really obvious way of doing it.
So I'm not aware of any studies, I'm not aware, it doesn't mean they haven't been done, of studies in which the randomization patterns themselves have been studied. We certainly have checked timings. This is particularly evident if you take a piece of software and run it on a machine that might be configured the same but is slightly newer, so the processor will go faster. And with shadow monsters, there'd be no way we could run that piece because the delays were not, for example, measured in seconds or fractions of a second. But I think that part of what the artists do with randomization is they use randomization within, typically, not always, but typically within a specific range of parameters. So in thinking machine, a number is randomly generated that becomes, quote unquote, the time it takes for the computer to think about its next move. So those behaviors are not behaviors that can be predicted, but by looking at the source code, we know what the range of the behaviors might be.
Yeah, so you know what the range of the behaviors is, but you don't actually know how much time that represents without some kind of instrumentation.
But,
right, if you're not measuring it in seconds, if you're just saying, I will iterate some random number of times, that depends how long it takes for a loop to iterate, which gets faster and faster as the museum.
In the case, so I'm sorry I wasn't clear. In the case of thinking machine, the random numbers actually represent seconds and fractions of seconds, so they can be calibrated accurately. In shadow monsters, it's relative timings, and it's not done in seconds or units of time, so they cannot be properly done. There are other works, there's one work in particular, the Guggenheim collection, where the timing does need to be very carefully calibrated, and so it's measured in that way. In terms of unit testing, I haven't seen that actually done in a methodical way. Generally, the artists try to turn in non-buggy code, although there's one artist we interviewed who talked about coming in on the first day of the exhibit and sort of going behind the scenes and making changes. It's a very different working environment than what I've seen outside of the art world.
He was proud of his buggy code, as I remember.
Yes, he was very, yes, he claimed it was buggy code, and that was part of the character of him and his code, but at a certain point, buggy code is not okay. So, Mark?
I just want to say, in terms of timing, and we chatted JP a little bit about it yesterday, but I think one case, the case of processing, they had this delay function in the earlier versions. And it was misused by so many people because it would just stop your entire program. So nothing could run. It would just be like, delay the program, everything for 30 seconds. So like, oh, this is being misused, and the founders of processing took it out. And everyone's like, oh, you should use a millisecond timer. It's a better timer. It counts the time in milliseconds from when the program starts. You have a variable of the amount of milliseconds you want something to happen, and then you compare them every time 1,000 milliseconds goes by, it works. And sometimes you get a call, and you're like, we ran this software, and it ran too fast. And I'm like, God, I would love to implement a nice millisecond timer, a nice counter. That case may come up. There's this question of change. But yeah, you do get these weird, funky timers, and it would be, nice to write a millisecond timer or such.
So yeah, it's not really about whether you should replace the code. It's like how you decide what timer you would put in there. Right? So you've got this one that depends on a particular platform and a particular form of the operating system, whatever it is. Yeah. Right. And then, but you've somehow got to determine what the range of variation of that time period is and how random it is, so that you can replicate it.
Well, maybe that's a good answer for yesterday's comment. Do you keep the bugs? Like when I see them, like, oh God, we should. And I was like, no, is that a quality of the artwork? And so it's very different from like business software and things like that. And is it a bug or a quality of the artwork? So.
It certainly is not like working on ATM software, which I have done, and it's very boring. It's a whole sort of different culture around the software, and there's also the fact that many of the artists are living, and so if they want it to be slightly more flexible than a bank would accept, then it's a work of art and not running an ATM machine. So I don't see a lot of the sort of quote unquote normal procedures in the art world that I see outside.
I had a question about assets outside the exhibition environment. As you conserve these things, and then they're not on an exhibition, and a researcher wants to come and see it, like what kind of assets do you provide, and then how do you keep assets overall? Do you mean you have many types of emulators ready for every software that you collected, virtualization boxes for everyone you collect? I mean, what's your assets policies and procedures? Do you have any?
It's not different than with all the other artworks in the collection. You come to the Guggenheim and see them, except for the web art pieces that live online and they're permanently accessible. They don't have Java issues, and there they are. Yeah.
But some art, or maybe they have like 8 projectors required. Like, how do you, like, what's acceptable access, or what extreme are you willing to go to accommodate, making sure they have full experience, or what's the substitute for it?
And you're talking about when it's not on exhibition, but people want to come and see the work.
Yeah, we're not in an exhibition, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
You're not going to always show us the artwork forever. You're going to, at some point, it's going to have to go into storage or whatever. So.
Yeah. So I would say with software works, as I said earlier, we're still working on that. But I think now, if you wanted to come and see Feng Mengbo, because Ben virtualized it, we were thinking that might be a good way of giving people access. We're also making a video of it. So no, we couldn't set it up for you, we have lots of artworks like that, no time-based media works where we couldn't set it up for somebody to come in, but we could allow some sort of access to those works. And as we work through our collections, Joanna was saying that she's trying to raise money to work on the pieces in her collection. I think as we go through that, then access will become better. Do you have any ideas?
I can understand you at all.
Oh,
I could expand on this, and then maybe you could comment a little bit more. In the early days of developing the digital repository at MoMA, I can't speak for the later days because I left, but we talked a lot about internal access and the problem that users within the museums, meaning curators, the AV team that installed the work, could have access to, say, versions of the works, both video and software works, that they could use to do their own research or actually use for exhibition purposes. So we talked about having the digital repository push video, for instance, to the digital asset management system where curators and others could have access to them. And we talked about the possibility of the public being able to access those versions of the works as well. Was that ever implemented, or where are you at with that?
Well, anything that is ingested into the repository is also sent to the digital asset management system, so any MoMA staff can stream anything on demand while on site. That has not translated yet to public access, but the DAM and TMS are the systems that are used for leveraging public access of images and other assets. So it has laid the foundation for really any kind of web-based access that the museum decides they want to implement.
We had talked about streaming video or allowing researchers to come in and watch all the video that MoMA owns. We'd have to get the artist's permission to show their work that way, of course. But I think there's a lot of potential now that these tools are exhibited or are being created, and versions are being created for internal researchers. That it seems like it would be the natural next step to allow the public.
Yeah, and I think on-site researchers are granted currently that kind of access.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you very much for this phenomenal couple days of presentations. I'm currently an intern at MoMA, but I haven't asked this question, and I think we skipped over it a little bit in the last panel. It's amazing that MoMA's made available Binder free on GitHub, open source, but I haven't asked, and I'm curious, if you're going back to an institution where you've just learned about making disk images and starting up a digital repository, what does it take to take Binder and make it work? And what size collection or how many items should you have before you start looking at that?
That's a complicated question, but I'll try and answer it as briefly and concisely as possible. So there initially was one actual technical barrier standing in the way of the general public just downloading and using Binder. That actually in a few months won't be an issue, so it will be something that will just work. However, the one issue is integration. So Binder is integrated with the TMS API. API is an application programming interface. It basically means it's a layer above TMS that lets us get the data out of TMS easily. MoMA actually had to build that layer because Gallery Systems has never built one. That, however, is free and open source and is completely interoperable with TMS. So really the first step would be, if you're using TMS, implement MoMA's TMS API. I've talked to our database administrator, and he said that's like a weekend project, so that's totally feasible. Frankly, if you have that in place, with somebody who's a bit techie and can, install, standard packages in Linux, it's feasible without relying too much on outside vendors. However, if you don't have that in-house, you would likely have to hire Artifactual Systems, which is the company that developed Archematica and Binder, to assist you in the installation. And they do offer support contracts as well for technical support. As far as when you should start considering that, that's not really a question that I can answer, because I think that that's a very personal question. I think that there are some institutions that say, well, our collection is very small, so it's not really worth the trouble. We'll continue to do things manually. However, I think that with manual processes, you leave the door open to benign neglect and processes that aren't really archivally sound, such as creating checksums manually and storing them in spreadsheets. That's not exactly a best practice or secure. So I think that these systems and automation, it's not necessarily about scale and bulk. Sometimes it's really just about the level of care you want to devote to your collection.
Mine's mostly just kind of a commentary and maybe some extra information. In the past, I've had problems with Flash applications running at different frame rates and having that timing problem. Typically, when you get the piece, if you capture the performance metrics and characteristics of it, you can actually set up a virtual machine or a physical machine and either overclock or underclock or scale the hardware components to actually match that of the required that are required by the software. So gathering those might actually be really important early on if it is a sensitive piece such as that. I mean, we all know artists aren't necessarily the best developers on the planet, so they're not going to adhere to all those standards and use the time-based ones. They might actually use frame delays or anything like that. So just want to mention that. Thank you.
You want to take one more question? And then we really have to wrap up. We're already running over time.
Most of the tools we used today in the first half were open source, and it's great that the MoMA digital repository is open source and conservator space is going to be open source. So I'm just wondering, how best could the conservation community support the open source community, make sure that there's collaboration going on so that the tools that the profession depends upon stay around and stay workable and are continual.
Through adoption of tools and funding of development. I think that museums, of course, spend very large sums of money on scientific equipment, analytical equipment for the rest of our collections. And MoMA has been in a place where we've decided that we will do the same for the rest of our collections. So we recently funded enhanced development of FFmpeg, Media Info. Oh my God. For example, and that's something that when you compare it to the amount of money we might spend on equipment frankly, it costs less than our digital video scopes for HD video that we purchased recently. So it's not an insurmountable cost. So I think if funding is an issue, then adoption and engagement with the community. I mean, going to EMEA, for example, and participating in the hackathon and frankly participating. But at the same time, I don't want to paint open source as like some kind of like magical solution. They say it's free and open source is not free as in puppies, it's free as in puppies, not free as in beer. A free beer is like, cool, a free beer, thank you. Whereas a free puppy is like, I can't have a puppy. Like, I live in New York, my apartment's tiny. So it's something you have to take care of, and it's a burden.
So yeah, how does this profession help shoulder that burden?
Engage, become a part of the community, instead of just like looking at it from afar.
I think there may also be, both in terms of training the next generation and in terms of IT support. I see just from conversations that people have had with me, because I'm not in a museum, that the role of IT may also be gradually shifting or expanding, so that IT departments, in addition to doing the traditional email server and file server and all of that stuff, may develop what we have in academia, an academic supporting group, which are IT professionals who know the workflows and know the type of research that a given group might be working on. And so that's where I see it going, and I think that would provide a great deal of support for the conservation profession, along with other aspects of museum administration.
Thank you.
Can I also use that question as like a springboard, because lots of people have been talking about, oh, this is great, this is really good that we're talking about this stuff. How can we continue these conversations? So thinking about, okay, who's using what open source tool, and kind of crowdsourcing, so lots of people do use those things. And this is really just the beginning of the conversation. I feel like an amateur with software-based work. Some people here are not, but I think we do need to keep that conversation going as a community, so we're not all doing our things in our silos, which is exactly the point of this Tech Focus.
Thank you, Kate.
Maybe one last comment indeed to spring off on that. I think there is actually quite a few things going on next to Tech Focus. There's quite a few communities already around, and it's indeed talking to us while we're here, and talking amongst each other is like finding out where things are happening. And indeed, I was also wondering, when you brought this question to us, also vice versa, what have you got in mind? That it's like a two-way thing. It's not a one-way thing, like, okay, we're going to give you everything. It's about communication and setting these things up ourselves and share them between us. And yeah, setting up a wiki is quite easy to do, I think, and a forum to make this work. Time differences are always an issue, but luckily these things happen, and we can actually meet live as well.
What communities should we be aware of?
Okay, let's see. Well, currently with a few people here and also a few people that are not here, we're setting up a community of practice in a way, and it's still in its very early stages. But I do welcome everyone who wants to be involved to get to me or Patricia, who's just sitting there as well. Get in touch with us, and we'll make it work. We'll try to make it into bigger group, and maybe have different things to continue talking about these things. So that's certainly one of the things. Another thing that I can make a nasty plug-in perhaps for as well is in February next year there will be a software-based conference also happening in Amsterdam. So keep an eye out also on the emailing list, and it would actually be a really good idea perhaps also for us here to see and start off with the Tech Focus in mind, to maybe set up a sort of emailing list, wiki or whatever, that we can actually post these things to as well. And that we can just build our knowledge from there, set up a bibliography, things like that. It's quite simple and can be really effective, I think.
And I think the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art, INCA, their website's down right now, but they are sort of an international clearinghouse for conferences and activities, new publications. So that's one thing, one place that everyone should be in communication with, or at least be on their list.
And just one last plug, the Digital Curation Google group, I think, is probably one of the most relevant listservs for people who are talking about these things. It's not about conserving art, but as far as the tools and strategies we've been talking about, it's just that kind of stuff, just more from the archival and library perspective. So that's really where a lot of those conversations are happening online.
Can I just answer your question to what are you doing? I think what I've noticed too in using the tools, the open source tools, and finding, updates that didn't happen or something like that, and then contacting the developer and this sort of community that's happening. It would be nice to be able to share that too in some space. It's like this tool, the exit tool, is out of date and it causes problems that are, updated everybody, So that kind of thing.
Thank you, and I think this also makes a great closing remark. I mean, certainly TechFocus was designed to provide a first forum to discuss this with a wider audience, with you, and now we will take it from there, and we'll certainly appreciate all the ideas, future guidance you have for us. We can certainly pick up on this during the annual meeting next year in Montreal, and certainly appreciate your feedback. So I now want to wrap up and thank the panelists and the speakers of day 2, and I hope all of you enjoyed TechFocus 3 as much as we did. And I want to also acknowledge that many of you made quite an effort to come here, although most of the colleagues in the room are from the US, but we also have participants who traveled from Switzerland, from Austria, from Scotland, from United Kingdom, from Mexico, and from the United Arab Emirates. So thank you for coming here. Thank you. And here's my question. Are you an EMG member yet? So if not, please consider joining us to support our activities and our programming. You can also consider to, well, ask your institution to become an institutional member, and you get the benefit to get access to our biannual publication, the EMG Review, which is the first publication worldwide that is entirely dealing with time-based media conservation issues. You can certainly, we would be thrilled if you want to visit our programming during the next annual meeting, which is going to be in Montreal in May, from May 13th to 17th. Kate Lewis is in the process of putting together, I'm sure, a wonderful program, and we would be thrilled to see you there as well. During the conference, there were questions regarding the PowerPoints and whether we live in the future, and also the video where it will be accessible in the future. As we mentioned, the PowerPoints might be not accessible in the future, but we have a website where we will post all the videos from the last 2 days. Allow us a little bit of time to do so, but we will certainly circulate the link to that website as soon as all the videos have been uploaded to the site. Well, as many of you know, the idea of the TechFocus workshop series was born out of the electronic media group of the AIC, the youngest group within AIC, and received tremendous support from other institutions and funding organizations. A project like this would not have been possible without generous funding. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all funders, but also supporters. And I would like to thank the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum for being such an extraordinary and generous host for this second focus workshop. And we have been here the second time already. A big, big thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts and their ongoing support, commitment, and funding of our TechFocus conference series. I want to thank the American Institute for Conservation and the Foundation of the American Institute and staff for their commitment as well. And thank you to the wonderful speakers, and thank you to the wonderful teaching assistants, to the theater staff of the SRGM, to the sign language interpreter, and the EMG TechFocus Planning Committee. And the tech, yeah, the theater staff. That's what I meant with the tech. But I would like to give a special thank to Joanna Phillips. It was really her who pulled it together in every single detail. She thought the program through in really not only the content, but also the organizational aspect. And this is why we had such a pleasant experience with no glitch and no hitch. Thank you, Joanna. It was really you spearheading that and putting it together. And I want to thank you, the audience. What would be TechFocus without you? And we hope to see you again for our future events. And Brian Castrioder.
Yes, you have to come up, Brian.
For all your assistance. Thank you so much. And again, I hope to see you all again soon. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.